I never thought a life could be divided so clearly into a before and after by something as simple as a Monday morning meeting. Up until that day, my work life was almost boring in how stable it was. I arrived at the office at the same time every day, coffee in hand, greeted the same faces, sat in the same cubicle. It wasn't the dream job, but it was solid. I'd been there for years. I knew the processes, the clients, the common mistakes, and how to avoid them. I was reliable. Sometimes invisible, sure, but safe. And that was enough for me. That morning, the atmosphere felt different. Not tense. Not strange. Just expectant. The rumors had been circulating since the week before: leadership changes, restructuring, a new head for our department. Nothing unusual for a large company. I'd already seen 3 different bosses come and go in less than 5 years. I walked into the meeting room without thinking much about it. Took a seat near the back, like always. Leaned against the chair and checked my phone while we waited. Low conversations, nervous laughter, that familiar office murmur that dies the moment someone important is about to enter. Then the door opened. At first, I only noticed the dark suit. Confident steps. Polished shoes. Then I looked up, and my stomach dropped. It was her. Not someone who looked like her. Not someone who reminded me of her. It was her. My ex-girlfriend. The person I shared years of my life with. The person I ended things with in the worst possible way. The person I hadn't seen, or thought about, or so I believed, in a very long time. Time stretched unnaturally. While everyone adjusted their chairs and offered polite smiles, I froze, a half-smile stuck on my face that never fully formed. My ears burned. My chest tightened. That childish urge to disappear under the table hit me all at once. She looked up, scanned the room, and our eyes met. Just 1 second. 1 second was enough for everything I'd buried to rush back. The arguments. The long silences. The breakup. The words that were never said, and the ones that were said too late. All of it passed through her eyes before she calmly looked away, as if I were just another stranger in the room. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice firm and professional. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm..." I didn't hear the rest. The noise in my head was too loud. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. She's a professional, I thought. This is a company, not a drama series. People grow up. They move on. Hadn't I? Throughout the presentation, she talked about goals, efficiency, necessary changes. She took notes, paused at the right moments, smiled when expected. No one noticed anything strange. No one except me, who felt like every word was aimed directly at my chest. She never mentioned our past. Not a hint. Not a lingering look. Absolute professionalism. That should have reassured me. It didn't. Because I knew her. I knew how she acted when she wanted control. I knew how easily she could separate emotions when it benefited her. And most of all, I knew that silence didn't always mean peace. Sometimes it was just the calm before something much worse. When the meeting ended, people stood up chatting about how prepared the new boss seemed, how organized she was, how much she promised as a leader. I stayed seated for a few seconds longer, trying to get my thoughts in order. As I left, I saw her talking to human resources, pointing at documents, nodding. Boss from the very first minute. Pure authority. I walked past her without her looking at me. Or so I thought. Just as I reached the door, I heard my name. Pronounced perfectly. Calmly. Without hesitation. I turned around. She looked at me with a small, perfectly rehearsed smile. "We'll schedule a one-on-one meeting later," she said. "Just to go over your role. Not our past. Not what we were. My role." I nodded, unable to say anything else. As I walked away, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years at that job settled in my stomach. Fear. Not because of my performance. Not because of my results. But because I realized, in that moment, that my past hadn't just come back. It had come back with authority, institutional backing, and the power to decide my future. And I still had no idea how much it was about to make me pay for a story that was never truly over. The first few days after she took over, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I told myself I was being paranoid, that mixing the past with work was childish, that if I stayed professional, she would too. For an entire week, nothing openly wrong happened. No confrontation. No sharp comments. If anyone had asked me, I would have said my relationship with the new boss was normal. Too normal. The first change was subtle. So small I almost ignored it. A report I'd been submitting the same way for months came back with notes. Nothing serious. A couple of formatting corrections, a suggestion about the approach. I fixed it without thinking much about it. The next day, another document came back. More comments this time. Still reasonable. Still explainable. Then a third. Then a fourth. That's when I noticed the pattern. Work that had always been fine suddenly needed revisions. Not real mistakes. Not serious flaws. Just details. Nuances. The kind of things you can't really argue without sounding defensive. What unsettled me was that the same standards didn't seem to apply to anyone else. In meetings, when someone else presented something incomplete, she nodded and suggested revisiting it later. When it was my turn, the questions were longer, sharper, more specific. Always calm. Always polite. Impossible to call out as hostile. "Can you explain why you chose this approach? What led you to that conclusion? Are you sure this is the most efficient way?" Each question made sense on its own. Together, they felt like a silent interrogation. I started over-preparing. Triple-checking my work. Anticipating objections. Walking into meetings armed with notes, numbers, and backups. Still, there was always something. One afternoon, after an especially uncomfortable meeting, a coworker stopped me in the kitchen. "Hey, everything okay with the boss?" he asked quietly. "She seems harder on you than the rest of us." My stomach dropped. So it wasn't just me. "She's just demanding," I replied automatically. Probably setting the tone. He nodded, but his expression said he didn't fully believe it. Neither did I. The one-on-one meetings started soon after. Always short. Always professional. Always uncomfortable. She sat across from me, hands folded, talking about objectives, metrics, areas for improvement. She never mentioned our past. Never raised her voice. Never said anything that could clearly be used against her. But there was something in the way she looked at me when she talked about commitment and accountability that made me feel judged for more than just my work. During one of those meetings, something happened that stuck with me. "I've noticed you're having trouble adapting to certain changes," she said, eyes on her screen. "You used to perform well, but lately." She paused. Lately what? I asked. She looked up and gave a slight smile. That's what I want to understand. I left that room with a heavy feeling in my chest. You used to perform well. Before when? Before she arrived? Or before something else entirely? I started doubting myself. My abilities. My memory. I wondered if I had ever really been good, or if people had just let things slide. If now, finally, someone was seeing flaws that had always been there. That was the real damage. Not the extra work. Not the corrections. The constant doubt. One night, while going through old emails, I found something that made my blood run cold. An email thread between her and Human Resources. It wasn't recent. It had started weeks earlier. Before she was officially introduced as my boss. My name was there. Nothing explicit. Nothing illegal. Just carefully worded phrases, performance concerns, potential risks, need for future evaluation. Every word chosen with care. With foresight. That's when it hit me. None of this was spontaneous. None of it was reactive. The invisible rules had already been written. And I was the only one who didn't know them. And while I was trying to prove I deserved my place, someone else was patiently, quietly building the perfect case to remove me from the game. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was shutting down my computer. Subject line, performance review. Attendees, her, someone from Human Resources, and me. It wasn't my first evaluation at that company, but I'd never seen a meeting framed like this. No clear agenda. No attached documents. No context. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every project, every email, every decision I'd made in the past few months. I searched for mistakes they could use against me. I saved backups, screenshots, files. I walked into the office the next morning mentally armed for a fight. The moment I stepped into the room, I knew something was wrong. She was already seated. Next to her sat a Human Resources representative who offered a brief smile before looking down. On the table lay several printed documents, neatly aligned. "Thank you for coming," my ex said calmly. "We want to have an open conversation about your current situation on the team." We. Not I. Plural. Institutional. Final. She began listing unmet expectations, adaptation issues, accumulated concerns. Every phrase came with paperwork, emails, notes, observations. I recognized the facts, but not the narrative. "This was discussed," I said at one point. "Those changes were implemented later. I have emails confirming the approach." She nodded slowly. "We're not saying you didn't work," she replied. "We're talking about impact. And consistency." It was impossible to argue with language like that. I defended myself. Explained context. Showed results. Pointed to successful projects. She listened carefully, took notes, nodded, and then reframed everything as insufficient. "The issue," she said finally, "is that this pattern has repeated." That was when I understood the trap. It didn't matter what I said. It didn't matter what I proved. The pattern had already been defined. And if there was a pattern, then it wasn't a one-time mistake, it was me. Human Resources spoke up for the first time. We've evaluated different alternatives, she said, and we believe an orderly separation is the most appropriate step. The word landed heavily on the table. Separation. A buzzing filled my ears. I looked at my ex. For the first time, she held my gaze without looking away. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction. Just resolve. Is this already decided? I asked, even though I already knew. It's what's best for both parties, she said. We believe the team needs a different dynamic. A different dynamic. I wanted to say so many things. Remind her of who I was before that room. Before that power. Before she had authority over my future. I wanted to talk about the past, about what we were, about how things ended. But I realized something crucial. That conversation never existed for her. Anything personal had been buried under layers of emails, metrics, and corporate language. Bringing it up now would only make me look emotional, unprofessional, unstable. I signed the papers with a trembling hand. When I stood up, she did too. I wish you the best, she said, extending her hand. I shook it. Brief. Cold. Final. As I walked out of the room, I felt something worse than anger or sadness. Clarity. Because I understood I wasn't being fired for my performance. I was being fired because someone, with power and memory, had decided this was the proper ending to our story. And as I packed my desk, I knew the termination wasn't the real blow. The real blow was everything I still didn't fully understand. The day I left the office, I didn't cry. I didn't yell or make a scene. I packed my things into a box, shut down my computer, and said my goodbyes in short, automatic sentences. Some coworkers looked at me with pity. Others with discomfort. No one asked many questions. In that place, learning not to ask was part of survival. I walked out of the building feeling like I'd lost more than a job. I'd lost stability. Identity. Routine. For years, that office had been part of who I was. And now, in a matter of weeks, it had been reduced to a termination email and a final handshake. The first few days were disorienting. I slept poorly. I woke up thinking I'd forgotten to send something, that I had a meeting scheduled, that I still needed to explain myself to someone. My mind understood I was gone long before my body did. Distance brought clarity. As I reviewed old files, archived emails, conversations I hadn't reread in years, I noticed something that had once slipped past me. The timeline didn't add up. The first performance concerns appeared right after a specific moment, not a work mistake, not a failed project. A conversation. Years earlier, when we were still together, I had turned down a major opportunity for her. A relocation. A career leap. At the time, I believed in it. I defended it as a shared decision. The relationship ended not long after. We never talked about it. We never closed that chapter. I buried it under the idea that sometimes things just don't work out. That you lose, you move on. Now, everything clicked. For her, it never ended there. Power didn't change her. It just gave her the perfect stage. She didn't fire me in an emotional outburst. She didn't humiliate me publicly. She did something far colder and far more effective. She used the system. She learned its language, its timing, its rules. And within that professional framework, she executed something deeply personal. That was the most disturbing part. There was no obvious villain. No dramatic scene I could point to. From the outside, everything looked clean. Justified. Professional. And I was left as the problem. Eventually, I found another job. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't easy, but it came. Different environment. Different people. Good feedback. Trust slowly returned. That's when I knew for sure it was never about ability. Sometimes, when I think about her, I don't feel anger. I feel something more unsettling, understanding. I understand how far someone can go when unresolved wounds meet unchecked power. That's why I'm telling this story. Not for sympathy. Not for revenge. But as a warning. When a relationship ends badly, it doesn't always end there. Sometimes it just waits, quietly, for the right moment, and the right position, to collect what it believes is still owed. And when that happens, there's no email, no performance review, no amount of effort that can save you. All you can do is leave, rebuild. And accept that the most devastating loss wasn't the job itself, but discovering what someone is capable of when they have power over your life.